Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating and heavily debated piece of source material that recently went viral. The core claim? That incredibly cheap, heavily modified consumer drones are somehow defeating one of the most technologically advanced militaries on the planet. We're going to unpack the claims, the tech, and the military strategies presented in this report. And just to be totally clear, we're not taking any sides here, we're just breaking down exactly what the source material is arguing. All right, let's jump right in.
Okay, let's dive into this. The entire foundation of this analysis rests on one pretty staggering question. How does a $300 drone challenge a multi-billion-dollar military? The source material paints this picture of a modern battlefield where the traditional rules of war and military budgets honestly just don't apply anymore. We're looking at a massive contrast between off-the-shelf, low-tech consumer goods, specifically these small drones, and the absolutely state-of-the-art, mind-bogglingly expensive defense systems used by advanced militaries like the IDF. I mean, how can a piece of plastic and wire bypass the world's most advanced radar systems? Well, that's exactly what the original report attempts to explain.
To really unpack all these claims, we're going to follow the roadmap from the source material. We'll trace the history, tactics, and tech across 5 key areas. First, the origins of the conflict. Second, surviving the decapitation strikes. Third, the asymmetric warfare strategy. Fourth, high-tech versus low-cost. And finally, the broader geopolitical repercussions.
Starting off with Section 1, Origins of the Conflict, a historical baseline. To understand the modern tactics claimed in the video, we really have to look at the history it lays out.
And this brilliantly illustrates the timeline they use. The analysis asserts that Hezbollah didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It argues that the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon was the direct catalyst for its formation during the Lebanese Civil War. The source traces this ongoing pattern right through the Israeli withdrawal in 2000, the 2006 Lebanon War, all the way up to the massive escalations we've seen across 2023 and 2024. According to this specific narrative, this decades-long history of skirmishes and invasions is what shaped a very specific type of fighting force.
The report argues that Hezbollah operates fundamentally as a guerrilla force. It actually draws direct comparisons between their historical strategy and the tactics used by groups like Hamas or even the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. You see, rather than facing a vastly superior, heavily armed invading force head-on, which they'd lose, the analysis states that this militia relies on hiding in expansive underground networks, launching sudden asymmetric attacks and then retreating. It's less like 2 traditional armies meeting on a battlefield and more like a high-stakes game of shadowboxing. And that foundational strategy really set the stage for the modern drone warfare we're seeing today.
Moving right along to Section 2, Surviving the Decapitation Strikes, Structure and Supply.
Now, the source material spends a lot of time explaining how Hezbollah manages to keep fighting despite taking some massive hits recently. We're talking about the assassination of their leader, Hassan Nasrallah. Then, there were those infamous pager attacks that wiped out huge swaths of their leadership in what the report calls decapitation strikes. On top of that, it highlights the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. That's a critical blow, especially considering Syria was the primary land bridge for weapons moving from Iran into Lebanon. Looking at all this on paper, a lot of international observers just assumed the group was completely dismantled.
But the analysis presents a pretty strong counterargument. It points out that Hezbollah utilizes a highly decentralized chain of command, which is heavily modeled after Iran's structure. So when top leaders fall, others just seamlessly step right in. And as for losing the Syrian regime, well, experts cited in the report note that the smuggling routes used to arm the militia aren't new at all. They're actually centuries old. The assertion here is that these deep-rooted networks can easily bypass sudden political regime changes, allowing the weapons to just keep flowing.
Which brings us to Section 3, the asymmetric warfare strategy, the FPV threat.
So the crucial point is how the source uses this concept of asymmetric warfare to frame the entire conflict. On one side, you have a force backed by highly advanced fighter jets, and on the other, a group with literally zero air force. To bridge that massive gap, the report details how Hezbollah has unleashed some highly improvised, really unconventional weapons to launch devastating surprise attacks against northern Israeli military assets.
And here is the specific tech that's changing the battlefield: the heavily improvised first-person view, or FPV drone. Now, these aren't your standard consumer models you'd fly at a park. The analysis describes these devices being tethered by incredibly long fiber optic cables. Because they use a physical cable instead of radio waves, kind of like a wired video game controller versus a wireless one, they're practically immune to traditional electronic jamming. Throw in thermal imaging and night vision, and these drones boast an operational range of 10 to 50 kilometers, carrying up to 7 kilograms of explosives. They're essentially unjammable guided missiles.
The original report outlines this fascinating micro-story of how a strike actually goes down, and it's a chillingly efficient three-step process. Step 1, they deploy standard, cheap observation drones to monitor troop movements. Step 2, operators use the drone's thermal cameras to identify very specific vulnerabilities, like the weaker armor on the back of a tank or troops seeking cover in buildings. And Step 3, an operator, who is usually safely hidden underground or in civilian infrastructure miles and miles away, launches that fiber optic drone, flying it directly into the target using a VR headset and a joystick. It's literally just like a video game.
All right, let's move to Section 4, High-Tech versus Low-Cost, an Economic Battlefield.
Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer financial mismatch. The analysis argues that this dynamic is actually Israel's most glaring vulnerability right now. Look at this stark mathematical contrast. You have off-the-shelf Chinese drones, assembled in bedrooms and classified as hobby equipment, costing roughly $300 to $500. On the flip side, a single Israeli Iron Dome interceptor missile costs around $50,000. And worse still, the source notes that these $300 drones are successfully targeting and destroying Iron Dome defense batteries that cost up to $95 million each. To put that in perspective, the report is basically pointing to a massive economic bleeding out.
And the technological argument they make is just as wild. Multi-billion-dollar air defense systems are specifically built to detect huge fighter jets and ballistic missiles using radio frequencies. But a low-tech drone, flying low to the ground and trailing a physical spool of fiber optic string, it emits absolutely zero radio signals. So the original report argues that by literally stripping away complex radio technology, these militants have somehow rendered some of the world's most advanced, expensive defense networks completely blind.
To combat this, the analysis neutrally outlines how the IDF is frantically scrambling for countermeasures. Because those high-tech radars are failing, they're resorting to some desperately low-tech solutions. The source points out tanks driving around with physical mesh, which it likens to mosquito nets, welded right over them. They're trialing drones that shoot nets, experimenting with laser interception, and even trying to equip infantry rifles with smart shooters to physically shoot the drones out of the sky. But the report is very quick to assert that these are mostly just in the trial phase and so far are proving largely ineffective against swarm attacks.
Finally, we reach Section 5, Geopolitical and Internal Repercussions.
Moving beyond the actual battlefield, the analysis explores the broader real-world impacts of these localized strikes. It pulls this exact quote from the Israeli UN ambassador to really capture the panic and frustration of a modern military facing this threat. This drone weighs less than 2 kilograms. It flies low, is very difficult to detect, and by the time you hear it above your head, it's too late. The source highlights the incredible irony here. An incredibly advanced army standing before the United Nations pleading for a solution against a 2-kilogram piece of plastic that they simply cannot stop.
The source claims that the internal repercussions for Israel are severe. The persistent drone threat in the north has led to the massive displacement of citizens who simply refuse to live in the affected settlements. The analysis asserts that the IDF is deeply overstretched by an endless war, facing such severe manpower shortages that they're allegedly attempting to recruit armies of mercenaries. On top of that, there's profound fear that if these unjammable drone tactics spread to heavily populated areas like the West Bank, it could lead to catastrophic internal political instability.
Let's move to the next point and see how this builds into the source's heavy skepticism regarding public information. The analysis explicitly distrusts the official narrative. While official reports at the time cited 28 soldiers and 4 civilians killed, the video report strongly asserts that these numbers are intentionally and heavily underreported. The claim is that this is a calculated move to hide the true extent of the damage inflicted by the drones, basically to manage domestic morale during a really grueling conflict.
Ultimately, the analysis points out a massive strategic paradox. As Israeli ground forces attempt to secure the border by pushing deeper and deeper into Lebanese territory, they are ironically making things worse for themselves. By advancing, the source argues, they are moving directly into the effective 10 to 50 kilometer range of these short-range, tethered fiber optic weapons. They are essentially walking right into a sprawling network of deadly, unjammable booby traps.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question to consider. If the claims in this analysis hold true, it completely rewrites the rules of global conflict. What happens to the world's superpower militaries when their multi-billion-dollar radar and missile systems can be entirely bypassed by a $300 toy retrofitted with a spool of fiber optic wire? It's a pretty stark reality presented by our source today, and definitely something that military strategists around the globe are losing sleep over. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.